The party had had quite enough to drink, it might easily have been said too much. It was about 3 o'clock in the morning when they finally found themselves at the Parrot Cage, a badly lit, badly ventilated, and extremely odd underground club in the purlieus of Shaftesbury Avenue. Most people made the platitudinous joke when they arrived, if this is the Parrot's Cage, it badly wants cleaning out, but Diana's party had long passed the stage of being critical. They had one united idea, and that was to have more champagne, for just as long as someone would go on paying for it. Eventually they had not dined in Park Lane because the butler had come upstairs to say that Sir Robert had telephoned that he would be in to dinner soon after 9. Diana, thinking that he might have business friends, and feeling that her own party, on this particular occasion, would not mix well, had taken them all to a restaurant. There they had enjoyed themselves quite as much, if not more, for was it not their habitual playground? Diana had got her maid to telephone Bibi to tell the others, but even so she herself took so long to dress that they had all arrived and already consumed several rounds of cocktails before the hostess put in an appearance. Dressed in flame-colored chiffon, with a cape of dark Russian sables, she looked very striking as she was bowed into the lounge by the obsequious maître d'hôtel. It was only as she sipped her first cocktail that she remembered something and gave a little exclamation. "What is it?" Hugo asked, as he stood attentively before her. "I've just remembered something," she said. "I got a message from Father to say that he particularly wanted to see me before I went out." She glanced at the clock. "It's 9:45 too late, now, anyway. I'll see him tomorrow morning." "I've a great admiration for your father," Hugo said. "He's a very clever person," Diana agreed. "I sometimes wish I saw more of him." "You are the most independent family I have ever met," Hugo said. "I never hear you mention your brother." "There's such a difference in age," Diana said. "Jimmy doesn't seem to mix well with my friends, even when he is at home. I think he must be going through a serious stage. Most people get it when they first go to a university. Let's go into dinner, I really feel rather hungry." Chatting and laughing, the party walked into the restaurant, the girls moving with the self-satisfied poise which expects admiration. The excellent dinner of appetite-inviting dishes was completely wasted on the party. Everyone smoked continuously, between and during the courses. Not one of them had an appreciation of wine, for their palates were already ruined by continual cocktail drinking. Champagne was the drink they most appreciated, with the exception of a few young men of the same persuasion as Cecil, who preferred gin. Everyone talked, no one listened, but there was not much said that was worth listening to. Diana had not quite rid herself of a wave of what she termed depression, which had settled on her ever since her weekend visit. To dispel it, she let her glass be filled again and again, until at last Hugo's conversation seemed scintillatingly amusing, Cecil's spiteful epigrams worthy of repetition, and she even felt a wave of warmth towards Bibi gushing gracefulness. "Let's go on," everyone cried, almost as soon as dinner was finished, and accordingly they piled into the car, the girls sitting on the men's knees, everyone chattering and laughing until they arrived at the next port of call. They went to 3 or 4 different places in the next 2 hours, seeing the cabaret here, dancing at another place for a few minutes to a noisy band, hurrying on to get a final drink at a well-known bar before it closed its doors against all revelers. They had arrived at the Parrot Cage. Another small band was doing its best to make a deafening noise. The tables put round the small dance floor were packed with a miscellaneous collection of people. Fat old women were pawing with jeweled fingers over dressed young men, discontented peroxide-headed girls were pouting over half-empty bottles of whiskey, which had depressed rather than enlivened them. Women in afternoon dresses, men in thick tweeds, rubbed shoulders with society hostesses in satin and diamonds, accompanied by immaculately dressed escorts in white ties and tails. The lighting was abominable, and was not kind to the faces it illuminated. Flushed with drink or the heat, or white from dissipation or drugs, they were not a pretty collection for a dispassionate reviewer. Diana's party quickly found a table, for the maître d'hôtel knew them all by sight. The manager, a young man who had originally been in the brigade of guards, and could now apparently find no better employment, hurried forward to welcome them. He was greeted effusively by most of the members of the party. "Bobby, darling," they cried, "lots of champagne for us. You know we ordered a case, hours and hours ago, on the telephone." "Quite right," Bobby answered, "it's waiting for you." With a wink he went behind the scenes, to send half a dozen bottles of sweet and exorbitantly expensive champagne to their table. "Come home, Diana darling. I want to talk to you," Hugo said, holding her hand under the table and leaning possessively towards her. Diana gave no answer to his remark. "Will you listen to me?" he asked, masterfully taking possession of her other hand and holding them crushed tightly in his. "I shan't," Diana said. She pulled her hands away from his and looked at him with mock severity. "I shall go and dance with somebody else. Tony." She called across the table to a tall, good-looking young man who was sitting beside Bibi, "Will you dance with me?" "Of course," he answered with alacrity. "I shan't let you," Hugo said, putting his arm round her, but Diana laughingly freed herself and ran onto the dance floor. She glanced back at Hugo flirtatiously over Tony's shoulders and made a little grimace at him. "Diana, you're adorable," Tony said in her ear. Diana smiled in reply, knowing that Tony made love to every woman he danced with, and that his lovemaking was charming but completely insincere. However, it was late enough at night for her to find his semi-passionate whispers quite entertaining, and she laughed a little and enjoyed dancing with him, especially when she saw Hugo's angry, sullen face every time she passed the table. Bibi, dancing with Cecil, bumped into them. "Hugo's madly jealous," she said in her shrill voice. "You are being awful to him, Diana. He's just snapped my head off, and I'm sure he's going to knife Tony." "Who's afraid of the big, bad lord?" Cecil asked, whirling Bibi away and twirling her fantastically until they bumped against somebody's table. Diana, feeling in the mood to annoy Hugo, continued to dance with Tony until he rose to his feet at last, and walking over to them stopped their progress. "I think it's time you danced with me, Diana," he said crossly, and taking her from Tony's arms moved away with her. "Hugo," Diana said, "what a way to behave. I'm damned if I'm going to let you go on dancing with that bloody fellow all night," he replied. Diana laughed. "What a caveman," she teased, all brutal and argumentative. "We are going home now," Hugo said, taking her towards the door. "Really, Hugo," Diana protested, "I don't want to. Anyway, there's the bill." "I've given Bibi the money to pay for it," he answered. "And you're coming back with me. I want to talk to you." Diana, secretly amused, pretended to be angry. "I won't be ordered about," she said. "You're behaving abominably." Hugo took her firmly by the arm. "Come on." "But my coat," Diana said. "I must have my coat, Hugo. I left it on the sofa." "I'll go and get it," he said. "I won't be a moment. You're not to come back into the room." Diana walked slowly up the stairs as he turned back to the dancing floor, pushing his way through the crowd of rumba-ing dancers towards their table. The fresh air coming through the outside door made her shiver for a moment, and then she welcomed its coolness after the heavy, fetid atmosphere downstairs. It was a lovely night, and looking up she saw the moon, and suddenly it brought to her memory the last time she had looked at it, last Friday, when she had walked in the garden at Huntsman's house and argued with Barry Dunbar. On an impulse she jumped into a waiting taxi, giving the driver her address in Park Lane. As they drove off she looked back and saw Hugo standing on the doorstep of the parrot cage, looking up and down for her and holding her sable wrap on his arm. She sat back in the corner of the taxi and smiled. That was a score against Hugo. After all, he must not feel so sure that he could dictate to her. And then she felt glad that she was going home alone. She somehow did not feel in the mood for his kisses. She was tired, it was late, and she felt there might even have been arguments about her dancing with Tony. When she arrived at Park Lane, she paid the taximan and taking her latchkey out of her gold bag opened the door. It was very quiet in the hall. Only one small light was left on for her, but the moonlight came through the long uncurtained window and cast strange shadows on the stairs and lighted a picture of Diana's mother, which hung, a full-length oil painting, on the wall. Dressed in the ugly, small-waisted fashion of 1900, she was still an exceedingly beautiful woman. Diana stood looking at the picture for a moment, and yet not really contemplating it, for it was too familiar for it to attract her notice. She suddenly had a queer feeling. The house was very silent, and yet she felt as though there was something unusual about it. She listened. There was absolute stillness, save for the tick of the grandfather clock which stood in the far corner. "What is it?" she questioned. She knew that she was being fanciful, but somehow in spite of herself she was startled to attention. Then, as she waited, she heard a taxi draw up at the front door, she heard someone run up the steps outside, and there came a sharp tap-tap on the glass door. It was Hugo, she knew that, and she crossed the hall again, and opened the door to him. "Don't be silly, Hugo," she said. "If you make a noise, you'll wake up the whole household." "Let me come in and talk to you," he urged. Diana shook her head. "I want to go to bed. I'm tired. I am, really. Please don't make a scene tonight." "Let me come in just for a moment," he pleaded, but she stood in the opening and would not let him pass her. "I'll talk in the morning on anything you like," she said. "Honestly, I am tired." He took her left hand in his. "Must you always run away from me?" he asked. "I don't know," she replied. He kissed her hand. "I ought to be very angry with you, and yet it is difficult to be." He smiled at her. "You are being rather nice," Diana said, "and I like you for it. I'm going to bed now, because I'm dead tired." Ring me up in the morning, and perhaps we'll dine quietly tomorrow night. He turned her hand over in his and kissed it again 2 or 3 times. Good night, my beloved, he said. Sleep well, and dream of me. He turned and left her. She shut the door and went back again into the house. Dear Hugo, she thought. It was rather nice of him to behave like that. She put her hand on the banisters and her foot on the first step, and then again that extraordinary feeling of something unusual came over her. I'm getting nervy, she thought. She looked round and noticed a light under the study door. Father is still up, she thought. I'll go in to him. She walked across the hall and opened the door softly. Sir Robert often slept in his study when he was tired from working, and no one roused him. He was not a good sleeper, and a few hours snatched uncomfortably in his armchair were better than none, whatever time of the day or night they occurred. Very quietly she entered the room. Sir Robert was not in his favorite armchair by the fire, but at his desk. Diana stood for a moment and gave a little gasp of surprise. He was sprawling forward, his hands outstretched before him, his head down on the blotting pad. For a moment she thought he was asleep, and then her eyes caught something which made her heart give a sudden leap, and then seemed to stand still, paralyzing all her thoughts. In his right hand Sir Robert held a revolver. It was a second or two before she could move, and then, even as she cried out "Father!" and went towards him, she knew quite certainly that he was dead. Diana sat in her room, staring with unseeing eyes through the open window. She sat completely motionless, striving to control her thoughts. Her emotions felt paralyzed to an inanity which made her question them again and again, to find no answer. It was as though the events of the past hours were seared in poster headings on her mind, headlines shrieking with megaphone voices to her brain, yet she herself was utterly incapable of comprehending or realizing at present the immensity of what had happened. Snatches of her own conversation, of the events which had followed each other in quick succession, of people coming and going, of her father's terrible silence, recurred to her as she sat in the sunshine. She could hear her own voice on the telephone, speaking to Sir Leverson Parker, the doctor she had known and loved since childhood. She telephoned his house, and it seemed that the ringing sound of the bell was interminable. At last he had answered. The clipped, calm voice, alert but unhurried, though he must have been aroused from sleep, said, "Hello. Who is it?" Then her own answer. "It is Diana speaking, Diana Headley. Sir Leverson, please come at once, it's father. He's dead." And Sir Leverson's quiet reply, "I'll be round in a very few moments." Sitting alone in that room. The terrible silence after she had put down the telephone, that sprawled, motionless figure, the fingers unclenched, the hidden face. She noticed that his hair was a little thin on top, that there was a tiny piece of white cotton on the sleeve of his coat, that one fingernail had a smudge of ink on it. Then on the blotter before him Diana saw there was a letter. It was folded over, and from where she stood she could read the words on it upside down, "To my children." As she read it she thought of her brother Jimmy. He must be told. He was at Cambridge. Could she telephone him at this hour, she wondered? And then she remembered that Sir Leverson would be arriving and she must wait for him in the hall, otherwise he would arouse the servants. She had a sudden horror of anyone else knowing what had happened. She had a sudden fear that the servants would come downstairs. Horrified and hysterical, they would seem to her like a gloating audience, enjoying even the terror of it. She went to the library door and into the hall. She felt as if years had passed since she stood with her hand on the banisters, ready to go up to bed. There was the sound of a car outside, and a second later she opened the door to Sir Leverson. He entered the study, leaving Diana in the hall. A moment or so later he came to her, closing the door behind him. Sir Leverson took her hand gently in his. "I'm sorry, Diana, my child," he said, "but I have to ring up the police." At the words, Diana gave a little cry. He led her through the library into the little morning room beyond. "I want you to sit here. I can't let you go to bed yet, because I am afraid there are 1 or 2 questions which you will have to answer. You must be brave, and I will spare you everything I can." He walked to the side table where Sir Robert always insisted that drinks and sandwiches should be left for anyone who might return late and feel hungry. Sir Leverson poured Diana out a drink, and she drank it mechanically, feeling the spirit burn its way down her throat. "What about Jimmy?" she said as she handed the glass back to him. "I'll get him right away," Sir Leverson promised. "You sit here quietly, my dear. I'll come back to you as soon as I can." He patted her hand and left the room. Questions, people talking, moving about, voices, the heavy tread of feet, the sobbing of an aroused servant. The next hour seemed to pass in a kaleidoscope which left Diana exhausted. Yet she was controlled to a point when she did what was required of her almost without thinking, merely obeying and answering questions until finally Sir Leverson took her upstairs and sent her to bed with a sleeping draught. She took it without question, obeying him like a child, too tired to rebel. She had awakened, after 3 hours dreamless sleep, to find Jimmy standing by her bedside. She gazed at him for a moment, forgetful of what had happened, and then suddenly the events of last night crowded back into her mind, and she felt the throb of consciousness bring with it an agony of mind which made her hold out her hands silently to him. He took them, and smiled at her very tenderly. "Poor old girl," he said, sitting down on her bed. "I couldn't get here before. Sir Leverson says you were wonderful." Diana stared at him for a moment, and then very quietly she asked him, "Jimmy, why did he do it?" He got to his feet again, and walked over to the window and stared out for a long time. Then he turned to face his sister. He spoke deliberately, his voice slightly harsh as if he were moved in spite of himself. "Because," he answered, "he was a crook." Diana sat up in bed violently. "What do you mean?" Jimmy drew a piece of paper from his pocket, and passed it to her silently. She recognized it as the letter she had seen last night, lying beneath her father's hand on his writing desk. "To my children" was written in his clear, round handwriting with the thick downward strokes which told of his determination. It was a short letter written by a man who all his life had detested sentiment, and who would not stoop to it now. He did not even ask their forgiveness for what he was doing to them. He told them bluntly the truth, and signed it with his full name. It was not entirely comprehensible to Diana, but even the most unfinancially minded person could have understood the main fact that Sir Robert could not meet his obligations, and that rather than face imprisonment he was taking what seemed to him the easiest way out. When she had read the letter, Diana put it down before her on the bed, and then looked across the room at Jimmy, who was standing watching her, with his hands in his pockets. "Can we do anything?" she asked, and he shook his head. "Nothing," he said. "Is it in the papers yet?" Diana asked. "It will be in the lunchtime editions," he replied. "Reporters are swarming everywhere downstairs. What are we going to do?" Jimmy shrugged his shoulders. "Face the music, I suppose." There was silence between them. Both of them were thinking of the last suicide of a world-famous financier, the horrifying publicity, and the terrible harm that his death had done in financial circles and to many individuals whom they knew. Diana's friends had suffered in different ways. Several of Jimmy's companions had had to leave college, unable to meet the fees, and they were both fully conscious of the mudslinging, the comment, and the criticism, in which they also had taken part. The man's name had been on everyone's lips in terms of abuse, and now it was to be their father's turn, and they who bore his name were bound to participate in his disgrace. The whole story seemed like a nightmare at the moment. It seemed untrue, fantastically impossible. They had no knowledge of Sir Robert's affairs, for he never discussed his work with either of his children, or for that matter with anybody. In the days to come, they were to realize that the shock was just as great to their father's closest friends. Even his secretaries had no idea that he had been facing a crisis of any sort. He pulled so many strings, he was interested in so many vast concerns, and with whatever company he was associated, he insisted on being the supreme controller and holding the reins of government so tightly in his own hands that it was impossible for anyone to be aware of the fight he had been putting up for some time. The moment the stock exchange learned the news of Sir Robert's death, there was the usual shareholders' panic, and the papers told every lurid detail over and over again. The newspaper posters carried his name emblazoned across them. The inquest and the subsequent funeral were nightmares from which Diana and Jimmy emerged white-faced, but controlled. Neither showed any signs of breaking down, but from it all Diana formed a new appreciation of her brother. Only 21, already he seemed to her senior. He looked after her, and kept her as much as possible from harrowing details which could be seen to by himself, or by Sir Leverson. It was only when the funeral was over, and they had seen their lawyer, that the greatest problem of all presented itself to them both. What were they going to do? The lawyer did not mince words over their prospects. Everything would be taken by the creditors. The only thing untouchable was their mother's money, which on her death she had left jointly between her children. It was so small that both Jimmy and Diana had forgotten its existence, and the dividends had been paid unnoticed into their banks. Now they turned to it with relief, eager to know the exact value of the only life buoy left to them in the gale which had in 3 days swept everything away. £125 a year each was, they found, to be their entire fortune. Diana stared at the figures, trying vainly to comprehend what this might mean. £100 had meant so little to her all her life. It had meant, perhaps, 2 or 3 dresses, a wristwatch she had liked in a spray's window, a new horse, or her expenses for a short trip abroad. And now little more than this same sum was to clothe her, feed her, and keep her for a whole year. "We can't do it," she said to Jimmy, in despair. "We've got to," he answered. Quite certainly, but for the first time, Diana realized that Jimmy was in some ways like his father. There was that line of determination in his jaw, that firmness about his mouth, undeveloped as yet, but which was so characteristic of their father's face. She felt admiration for her brother at that moment, and she guessed a little of what this was meaning to him. He had loved Cambridge, enjoyed every moment of it. He had been popular and his great ambition was to get his rowing blue. When he had been writing a letter to the authorities last night, saying he could not return, she had seen him suddenly clench his hand and turn away from the writing table as if with difficulty he restrained himself from tearing up the letter he had just written. But when he had spoken to her, his voice had been quite normal, and she had almost doubted her own eyes. "What am I to do?" Diana asked Jimmy that night. They had that afternoon received a notice to remove themselves as soon as possible from the house, which was to be put up for sale. "Can you go and stay with anyone in the meantime?" he asked. Diana shook her head, and then she remembered the letter from Lolia. It was to be some weeks before Diana realized how very few people had written to them or expressed any sorrow for the tragedy in which they were involved. Out of the hundreds, perhaps thousands of people who had been entertained and feted at the Park Lane house or at Morton's, perhaps 1 in every 100 wrote to the 2 lonely children trying to cope with a chaos which was utterly beyond their comprehension. Friends of their own age were dancing and drinking the hours away in happy unconcern, whilst the older people were cursing and damning their former crony, whom they had toadied to and flattered, anxious not only for his friendship but for his financial advice. None of these people was likely to give a helping hand, or even spare a kindly word for the offspring of the man who had affected their pockets. Afterwards Diana and Jimmy remembered those last days in the house in Park Lane with a vivid horror. It seemed as if they stood amongst the ruins of everything which had mattered to them, of everything in life which had been so much part of existence as to seem absolutely indispensable. Outsiders thought them hard and completely unfeeling, because they neither screamed nor cried, were neither hysterical nor prostrate with emotion. The people around them thought their reserve was indifference. For themselves, they felt that they were utterly alone, standing insecurely on a bare rock, facing the surrounding angry sea of public opinion. The only thing they were frightened of was of losing their courage, of sinking down into the waves which swept higher and higher around them. Even if they could have forgotten for a moment what had occurred, there was the curious crowd outside the front door to remind them, the restlessness of the servants inside the house, and the difficulty of avoiding reporters who sought them as eagerly as hunters after some rare beast. Lolia's letter to Diana was the kindest she received, and the only one with any form of invitation. "Come to Huntsman's house," Lolia wrote. "We are alone, but if you feel you would rather not see us, there is the castle at your disposal where you can be completely on your own. I do hope you will come, Diana darling, and remember, if we can help in any way, you know we both really want to." Diana showed Jimmy the letter. "I should go," he said as he finished reading it. "It is much the best. It will give you time to think what to do." "Will you come too?" Diana asked, but he shook his head. "I've got to get a job," he replied. "What sort of a job?" Diana asked in surprise. "God knows," he answered. "But I shall find something. You will have to do the same thing, old girl, or else get married." And for the first time since her father's death Diana thought of Hugo. The suicide of Sir Robert Headley was a 9 days wonder. His life story was apparently of immense interest to the public he had defrauded. Pictures of him as a child, as a schoolboy, as a young man, were raked from all corners of the world and collected and published in every form of article, story and newspaper interview. Servants he had employed 10 years ago found their opinions of him were listened to with interest and respect. Chauffeurs he had dismissed found vent for a long-standing grievance. Gardeners were paid for his comments on seedlings or agricultural produce. Anyone who knew him in the city was prepared to swear that they always had their suspicions of his schemes. In truth, Sir Robert was not so much a clever schemer as a man who failed where many other men had succeeded. The markets had gone against him, and to save himself he had plunged deeper and deeper into the financial abyss, until finally he had been unable to prevent disaster. A modicum of good luck, and he would have pulled off his deals, and his friends would have rallied round as before, ready to cheer him on, even though the more astute of them might have suspected that his dealings were verging near the margin of the straight and narrow lines of honesty. Sir Robert was a self-made man, but his origin was not so humble as he liked to pretend. Most men who have achieved great things have a desire to prove themselves even more brilliant than they are, by asserting that their beginning was in the gutter. Sir Robert, in public speeches and after a good dinner, was always ready to describe himself as going barefooted to school. As it happened, his father was a small tradesman in the north of England, who brought up his son economically, but certainly without hardship, and had given him the best education he could afford. When he was 14, his father died, and he went to live with an uncle who was in the shipping business. At 18, Robert Headley was working in Canada. At 24, he had traveled a good deal in a rough, unluxurious fashion. At 28, he had gone into the merchant business, and was earning a salary which seemed to him a comfortable fortune. 20 years later, his name was well known in the city of London. When he was 52, he was made a baronet for his financial services to the country. But the bald story of his life was not what interested the public now. What they liked were stories of his ruthlessness in business, of his interest either at home or abroad, of his rudeness to reporters, and of his domestic likes and dislikes. Stories of his luxurious mode of living were exaggerated until Diana and Jimmy were quite unable to recognize the descriptions of their own home. Quite normally decorated rooms were described as though they were treasure houses of barbaric splendor. Bathrooms, cellars, and even the usual offices of the houses were described in terms so glowing that had they been paved or piped with gold, they could not have conveyed a more fantastic idea of needless expenditure. From being a financier with vision who had failed to bring off a deal, and therefore lost a large but not irreplaceable portion of public money, Sir Robert became a monster who had deliberately defrauded innocent people for his own ghoul-like satisfaction. Diana naturally did not escape such wholesale condemnation. Pictures of her wearing wonderful jewelry, descriptions of her furs, her new car, or any other reports of her which had at any time appeared in the public press, were collected together and made into a manual of a poor little rich girl. As she got into the train at Paddington, feeling as if she herself was a criminal in her efforts to escape recognition, she saw pictures of herself prominently displayed on the bookstalls. The private life of Sir Robert Headley could be read in this week's Tittle Tattle, while his intimate story, by one who knew him well, was to commence on Sunday in the news of the town. One was invited to order one's copy now, to be sure of getting it, because of the increased demand. For the first time in her life, Diana traveled third class. Jimmy saw her off, and found her a comparatively empty carriage. He kissed her affectionately. "Take care of yourself," he said. "I'll let you know my address in a day or so. I should stay for some weeks until things have blown over." "Goodbye, Jimmy, darling," Diana said, and there was a suspicion of tears in her eyes, a tremble in her voice. She felt she could not let her brother go. He had been wonderful to her these last few days. It had not been so bad with the two of them facing the future together, but there was something terrifying about going on alone, or meeting outsiders. She leaned out of the window waving to Jimmy as the train left the station, and something about the square of his shoulders, his smile, and his hand raised in response, gave her courage to choke back the tears, and to powder her nose with complete self-possession as she sat down again. She had written to Lolia saying might she go straight to the castle, and that she would like to be alone for a few days without seeing anyone. "I've got to think," Diana wrote, and she repeated the words now. Events of the past days had gone too fast for her to comprehend anything or do anything except what was required of her at the moment. Diana had been amazed at the way Jimmy faced things, and, young though he was, looked after her as if she had far less experience than he. Looking back over the years she had lived with her father, Diana could not remember one occasion on which he had discussed any intimate subject with her. Yet she reproached herself that at the last she had failed him. Had she gone to see him that evening before she went out, could she have prevented what happened? That was the question she asked herself again and again, finding no answer, as she went over and over the events which had followed her return home. What had he wished to tell her? Would he just have asked her where she was going, and kissed her perfunctorily good night, as he often did? Or would his reserve have broken down, and would he have told her the predicament he was in, and of the only escape which seemed possible? Diana knew she would never cease to blame herself for her carelessness in not obeying his request. How much might have been altered, she thought, and yet again she was honest enough to admit that perhaps it was as well that Sir Robert had taken the course he had. The humiliation of a trial for a man of his temperament, and the disgrace of being sentenced to what must have been a long-term imprisonment, would have been a hell which neither of his children would have asked him to enter. It can't be true, Diana thought. The train seemed to echo it in her ears, it can't be true, as the wheels turned over and over, carrying her away from a home which she would never see again. It was rather bewildering to think that she had no place to go to now, that Morton's was gone, her horses with it, and she prayed that they would find kind owners who would love them as much as she had. She kept remembering idiotically that one of the dogs had just had puppies, and wondering what they would do with them. She could not bring herself to ask such a trivial question, but it kept recurring to her mind. Jimmy had promised to see that her clothes were packed up and stored somewhere. They were all that she was allowed to keep. She had offered to give up her jewelry, but both the lawyer and Jimmy had refused to allow her to do so. "You will need it," Jimmy said. "It will bring you something when you sell it, not much, I'm afraid, these days." I think your offer is entirely praiseworthy, the lawyer had said pompously, but at the same time, if you will for tribute towards your father's deficits would only be a drop in the ocean, while such a sum will be of use to you. The two other passengers in her compartment left the train at Oxford, and Diana was alone. She opened her bag and took out a letter, and read it slowly. It was from Hugo, and was the second he had written to her. It was very kind, very considerate, and yet underneath it she had an uneasy feeling that he was writing because he felt he must, not because he wanted to. I am getting super sensitive, she told herself, and yet she knew her intuition was right, though it hurt her to admit it. There seemed to her a lack of spontaneity in his sentences, and a lack of enthusiasm. She tried to analyze his feelings and understood that for him the position was insupportable. He had loved her when she had been an heiress, rich, sought after, pretty, and admired by most of the people he knew. He had desired her that night on the steps of her house, wanting her, and knowing himself completely committed to his desires. The next day had offered to him a girl whose name was branded over Europe, penniless, with few friends and many enemies. Still the same girl, perhaps, but who is big enough to stand against public opinion, to deny that material things count, and not to admit that what people say about those we love does matter to a certain extent. Hugo had behaved well. He had written, he had attempted to see her, he had sent her flowers. Diana knew that he must have known he was behaving well, and she somehow could not bear the thought of his being gentlemanly where their relations were concerned. She wrote him a grateful letter of thanks, adding, I am going away for some time. Please do not worry about me in any way. The scenery changed until Diana was once more in the fruit-growing county of the Vale of Evesham. She remembered how happily she had come there just 2 weeks ago. Now they have taken everything, she thought, even my name, but I am still alive, I am still here. Although she did not know it, she came to the conclusion which has been the basis of every philosophy since time immemorial, the only foundation stone on which thought and understanding can be built, the only rock of which the individual is certain, I am I. Like and subscribe.